Stanford University.
You're not getting, well, they have to switch it on. They switch that. Ah, we're on.
Okay. It's not super duper critical, but it would be good.
Welcome to the Seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. We're almost at the end of the quarter. We have one more session next week. We'll have Tim Bickmore from Northeastern University, who's done work on using anthropomorphic interfaces, like robot things that look like people in some way, for users, underserved communities, non-literate users. So it'll be interesting to hear how he combines those. Administrative, if you're taking the course for credit, if you have attended all sessions and signed the sign-up list, you are done. Forget it. Otherwise, you'll get an email next week telling you what to do to get credit. This week we have Michael Naimark, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years since we were both at Interval Research back in the early 90s. And he has had a very interesting career on this sort of borderline between technology and art and entertainment. Really pulling those, just as I said last week when we had Peggy Weil here, that a lot of the interesting technical advances have sort of been driven, as you know, by entertainment needs, entertainment technologies. And he's just spent, he said, the last 4 years living in Hollywood, or near Hollywood, at the USC Film School. So he really, and before that he was at the MIT Media Lab a while back, so really has a mix of the technical, artistic, and entertainment understanding, which is, he'll be talking about and representing Earth.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure. Okay, there's still no audio. It's all ambient. It's not really super important. You know what? No, that's me coming out of here. There's probably a. Oh, you know what?
But then it won't get onto the recording.
You know what? Okay, never mind. Let's just do it here, because again, it's only ambient. Okay. Hi, and thank you, Terry. And we're up. Good. Okay. I'd like to begin with a couple assertions, at least as a provocation. Does anybody recognize this? If I were to add the word pygmy, ringing a bell, as in Mbutu pygmies in Zaire, Africa. If I were, to add the word buffalo, okay. Here's the quote. It's from Colin Turnbull, the anthropologist, book, The Forest People. Then he saw the buffalo still grazing lazily several miles away, far down below. He turned to me and said, "What insects are those?" I told Kenji that the insects were buffalo. He roared with laughter and told me not to tell such stupid lies. Now, Turnbull, sounds like we have audio, was a titan of what you might call pre-postmodernist anthropology. And Kenji, of course, was his young Mbuti pygmy who was his guide. The details about this are entirely sketchy, and even Turnbull later in life questioned a lot of it. But, and by the way, when they got down to where the buffalo were, Kenji got it, oh, okay. But when you do a Google image search for what insects are those, incredibly, this is what comes up. So this is one of those famous stories about how we see and how we see differently, ostensibly. A friend once tried to convince me that native Africans don't see V's when they look down the road. And several years ago at the San Francisco Film Festival, these German filmmakers were working with tar rigs and said they had never seen an image before, ever. And sadly, it's always Africans. And I wanted to talk with them, but I went up to the director, who I knew afterwards, and he laughed and he said, yeah, we had people come through like this before, and they were talking about Africans couldn't see, and see the same way we do. And these teenagers that were going along with the filmmakers, and then they found out that the teenagers actually were Herzog fans. So the first assertion I'd like to make is to take these two words that are volatile in many critical theory circles and propose, at least for argument, that a photographic ground truth really does exist, and that we're all probably wired about the same way. We might have very, very different perceptions about what we see, and we all know, Photoshop and whatnot, that we can't believe an image, but that whatever happens in front of us is essentially the same thing. Does everybody recognize this? Dealey Plaza, JFK, huh?
Grassy knoll.
The grassy knoll, right. It turns out that there are several hundred known photographs taken of the Kennedy assassination, plus or minus a few minutes, and several films other than the Zapruder film. And it's long been suggested for years to make a 3D plus T computer model out of this. They tried to do this at the Media Lab. It would clearly have to be a labor of love, and they never did. But several years ago, the Discovery Channel did, and it really was a labor of love, in that this all had to be done sort of hand alignment. But what's kind of interesting about this is when they start the video, is to think about spatial seamlessness and temporal seamlessness. So that was a pretty good visual spatial match cut. That was a perfect one. So was that. That was sort of a temporally seamless but spatially different cut. Still gives me the creeps, looking at this from so long ago. And no one's ever put this all together like this before. That was then. I first heard the phrase "a thousand Zapruders" from Martin Krieger, a professor at USC. Gets credit for this. But the second assertion is that today all events have 1,000 Zapruders. You can't go anywhere without photographic and video coverage, and that's a game changer. Okay, a few years ago, I started looking into the range of ways that we represent Earth, because they had started to explode around 2007, particularly relating to photo and video. And this was sort of a first pass at what was out there. You don't have to, sort of scan it. And eventually sort of boiled it down to this as a rough organization. I gave several talks fleshing it out. And then last fall, I had the opportunity to teach a class at NYU on this, and this is what came out, and it's still clunky. The goal here and this talk is to try to get a sense of the big picture of what's going on around Earth representations, and there's still a lot going on. Okay, let's begin. I didn't make up that phrase. This is a 1906 stereoscope, and on the back, it says "just like being there." This obviously has been a dream for a long time. But let's even get more fundamental. I see some friends in the audience. You may recall that this was sort of my favorite question a long time ago. It's kind of a difficult question, but everybody knows that I'm not a movie right now.
You're saying that people are all going to be
watching it on video, I know. Sorry, where's the camera? One time I set up a screen, I had to give a talk to fifth graders, which is a little bit scary, and I asked them, how do you know I'm not a movie? They were all silent. And I finally said, do you know I'm not a movie? And they all nodded, and then they started giving sort of the normal answers. One kid in the back said, you don't seem like an actor. But there are some formal reasons why movies do not look like reality, like the low spatial and temporal resolution, the fact that the scale is almost always incorrect, that our eyes focus on the plane of the screen and converge on the plane of the screen, and each eye sees the same thing, and when you move your head, nothing happens. And one way to look at it, at least in the sense of verisimilitude, is a mixing board analogy between the subject and the representation, and I used to write papers on stuff like this. The funny thing is that we've all had the experience, I bet, of sound, of turning around because you've heard something off of a hi-fi, you think somebody's in the room, but the eye is really, really hard to fool, and there are industries built around this, SIGGRAPH conference, whatnot. And this works in both directions for sensors and effectors. So in theory, if we know what all the sliders are, the elements, and if they're all turned up to 10, then by definition, the representation is indistinguishable from the subject. And if that's not the case, we have artifacts. And the word artifacts is a funny word because in CS and computer science circles, it's something bad which you want to eliminate. But in the creative community, artifact usually means something good, something sort of with expression and by hand behind it. Sorry, Sally. Head-mounted displays is one way to get a sense of being there. This is from 1990, NASA, and if you think that that was a fad, this is from last year in the blogosphere that Apple has a very interesting patent on a very elegant way to do head mounts. You're all familiar with caves, another way to sort of get a visual feeling of being there. Here's a Virtusphere. You see he's wearing a head-mounted display, and you can walk. I tried one of these a few months ago, and I don't see how this guy's actually standing and holding a gun. It's really not like walking. It's hard, but it's interesting. Here's a recent 360 projection panorama at the New Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, MPAC, at RPI in upstate New York. Here's a very sort of practical system by Luc Corchen at University of Montreal called Panoscope 360. Uses a single fisheye lens. The resolution isn't great, but it looks surprisingly good. This was an experiment that I did with colleagues at Interval Research in the mid-90s, and the idea was to film with a slowly rotating camera and project it in stereo, because it was shot in stereo, where the viewers stand on a slowly rotating floor. And this is hard to describe unless you've done it, but the effect is exactly like when you're sitting in a train in the station, the train next to you pulls out and you think you're moving. It looks kind of like this. So this is without the curtains around it. But you get this very, very visceral feeling that the screen is moving around you. This was an installation called Be Now Here, Interval Research in cooperation with the UNESCO World Heritage Center, where we had the opportunity to film 4 different sites in danger. And the camera didn't move, so for example in Jerusalem you can change time of day and the registration is perfect. Just a year and a half ago, I finally had an opportunity to use the same footage and do something a little more practical with the new generation of 3D-enabled consumer televisions. And because of how it was filmed, if you offset the footage accordingly, you would end up with a spatially contiguous panorama, even if it would have time artifacts. And again in 3D. And what's going on here is noteworthy in that his focusing mechanisms, his accommodation is wrong. They're focusing on what looks like 4 feet ahead, but his convergence circuits in his eyes are doing the right thing because the left eye and right eye see a displaced image. You've probably caught wind of this. This is Google's Liquid Galaxy, formerly called the holodeck. I haven't seen it. It's certainly an impressive idea coming out of Google. And the words that I've been hearing about it is that it's hot because they're plasma screens, and again, you're converging and accommodating incorrectly. So a proposal that I have into them, if you look at the right-hand one first, is to put a magnifying sheet in front of each one, which at least would fix the accommodation problem. And it turns out that works pretty well. And if you do that, then you can put sides on and you put a fan and actually get rid of the heat. This is the new Deep Space Theater at the Ars Electronica Center in Linz, Austria. And it's a 9 by 16 meter wall projection in 4K, very high resolution video. And the floor just looks like it's white, but that's another 4K projection. Okay, that's actually an image, that shadow. So that's what it looks like. And a project that didn't happen last year was to essentially put Google Earth in here. And you've probably all had the experience of bouncing from one place to another in Google Earth, where you go up, see the whole Earth, and come back down. The idea of having a public projection space where the Earth literally falls out from under your feet and you go up is, to me, a very, very exciting idea. And it has, I think I have some hints on how to do it, and there are a lot of problems. Okay, billions and billions of photos. Flickr, there's something really good about Flickr. It's open-ended, it's a free-for-all. They use folksonomic tag organization, a word I hope you all know. And this was pulled this week, over 4 billion images. That's a lot to do all sorts of interesting, unique things. This I pulled from the Internet Archive. This is the home page from 2004. And it's so quaint. Here's their blog around that time, and Katerina, one of the co-founders, discovered a new tag, frog. Here's what frog brings up now. I don't know if you can read that, but it's over 200,000 hits, photos tagged frog. But things got more interesting when people realized that they could have up to 70 tags on Flickr, and started tagging things like cats in sinks and circles and squares. And applications like Color Picker that allow you to sort of find images based roughly on color, or Retriever, where you draw a rough sketch in color and shape, and it does a kind of interesting job at finding, but it requires lots and lots of images to even try something like this. I don't know what the nude is doing there. The cat in the bottom right is actually surprisingly close. And this is a SIGGRAPH paper from 2007 that came out of Carnegie Mellon. And you can imagine that, and the title says it all, that you really can do scene completion if you have enough images, like lots and lots. But in terms of Earth representation, a lot of these are geotagged now. And either by hand or using GPS and the EXIF standard in cameras. Flickr currently has about 100 million images geotagged. Panoramio was an acquisition by Google in 2007, and it's like Flickr Maps. Everything is geotagged. There are currently over 20 million photos geotagged. And they can appear in Google Earth if they are accepted. And they have an acceptance policy, and it includes what they don't accept are people posing, cars, pets, flowers, close-ups, events, and so on. So it's clear that, number one, this is very different from Flickr. This is a very sort of less lively, free-for-all collection of images, and you might call them neutral images. More on that in a little bit. This was the most recent update I could find. It's over a year old, on trying to sort of crack open how they do the acceptance policy. 15 million some, but if you do the numbers, and if somebody's sitting down and spending 5 seconds for each one, that comes out to almost 3,000 days, or almost 8 people years of work. But I've been living in LA, working in Hollywood's favorite film school at USC, and these numbers really aren't daunting. I mean, if you're mostly CS people and you're thinking of automating, they might be, but just for comparison, I couldn't resist doing this. So, when you're making a movie and at 24 frames per second, your budget allows you to pay over $1,000 per frame, there's an awful lot of things like like touch-up, that can be done. Okay, moving, morphing, and merging, please note that all movies and television today fit into this category. That's different from 3D models and video games. Cinema and television is an illusion made by going from 2D image to 2D image. And consider what happens when we move through space, like walking down the street. And what happens when you carry a camera walking down the street. One of the most interesting differences is how our eyes compensate for the angular discrepancies. You can fixate and do this, and they do a very good job. And there are image stabilizers for cameras that do this. These, by the way, are very different than Steadicams, which is just a bunch of weight to slow things down. These have active sensors and motors in them, and they can compensate. They're also not cheap, and there's a little cottage industry in Hollywood around these. They're used all the time. Sorry about the bad frame rate here, but you'll get the idea of, in a weird way, it looks more normal, but it takes a lot of work to get that to happen by doing this angular compensation. This is more what the eye does. This is a clip from a movie called Transcan by a Canadian independent filmmaker, Stephen Arthur. Now, incredibly, he did this by hand in post-production by shooting with a much wider lens and then fixating on things. Actually, I'm going to play this twice. This, I would argue, is a little bit more like what we do. He's hand selecting what to fixate on, and this is hard stuff. But I would argue again, this is as good as it gets in terms of what our eyes see. Now he's fixating on the car. Okay. Now, what I'm about to say may be just old hat to all of you, so bear with me for a second. But consider the difference between making in-betweens of two images that are laterally displaced compared to two images from the same point that have an angular displacement. And the latter is really pretty easy stuff, and it's used all the time in panoramic tiling. As long as you get the camera on the nodal point, which is the point when you pan, tilt, rotate, and zoom, there's no disparity. There's no lateral component added, and there are companies that make little camera mounts for doing this. And just as a data point here, you've probably all seen Disney's Circle Vision 9-screen surround. The camera that they developed for this, and sorry I don't have better images, have the 9 35mm motion picture cameras all pointing straight up at 45-degree angle mirrors. And the reason why, so that they would all share the same single nodal point. That's how much trouble they went to get it right. The discrepancy shows more and more when you try to tile near-field objects, and we'll get a little more to that in a second. So this is close enough to the difference between angular and lateral that I really wanted to sneak this in. Rephotography is a Wikipedia category, and these folks, Mark Klett, do this all by hand. And I've met these guys. They don't know sift and ransack from beans. They know how to take a historical image and find the lateral and the angular and the zoom place and get it right. And as you can imagine, if it's wrong, it loses the magic. There's something magic about this perfect registration. At the other end of the scale, trying to get lateral in-betweens is so difficult that the common technique is just use a ton of cameras. This is, of course, from the bullet time sequence in The Matrix. And you can't see the right-hand camera, but the cameras at each extreme are motion picture cameras, and then all the other ones, I think you all know this, are still cameras that go up simultaneously so that you can go from motion to apparent motion by movement to the other camera If there was an easy way to do in-betweens, they wouldn't be doing this. So angular and lateral merging and morphing are different. And angular is relatively easy if you're on the nodal point. Lateral is difficult, and it can never be perfect all the time because there can always be occlusions between your two images. A favorite example of one of my interval colleagues is if you take a picture of a door from here and here, but the keyhole can only be viewed here. There's no way on earth that you can derive what through the keyhole from these two views through some synthetic means. So now we're finally ready to talk about Street View, Google Street View, and there are many similar ventures now, and I think you all know what I'm talking about, camera cars going up and down the street. So Street View, I think, got the angular part really good. It's not perfect because the cameras are not on the nodal points, and they're going to run into problems when they start going into stores, as they're doing soon. The farther the cameras are displaced, the more impossible it's going to be to stitch things together. But what I'd like us all to do here is look at what's happening on the lateral in-between images. And firstly, if you ask yourself the question, are any of them usable images? The answer is clearly no. It's some means of smoothing for the eye. Do it one more time. And it's clear that it's not a simple dissolve. They started with simple dissolves. They're doing some zoom dissolve hybrid. Here's one of the competitors, Everyscape. They do something better, and you can maybe guess what they're doing here. I think it has something to do with assumptions about the ground plane. And to me, it's definitely better, but if one were to ask, are any of the in-between images usable, credible images, the answer is clearly no. The stuff isn't that new. Here's an image. I'm compelled to show this stuff. This is 30 years ago, and the blob of brown hair there is me as a student. This was in Aspen, Colorado, where we shot with panoramic film cameras going down every street in town, shooting one frame every 10 feet, triggered by a fifth wheel on the back. And part of getting the smoothness right is a trade-off between smoothness and frame real estate. And there's nothing you can do about it. But the other trick is to make sure that it's as visually seamless as possible. And in this case, by shooting turn sequences to match the straight sequences, we shot between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And I think the Street View people do similar. So there's minimum disparity. This was several years later, actually 1986 in Paris, on a little cart. And this looks crufty only because of the CCAM to NTSC transcoding that had to be done. But the actual video disc of this was quite crisp. And our solution to filming turns was to hire mime and have her stand at every intersection and point. And a cut from a pointing mime to the direction you're going actually is very cinematic, and you believe that that's the direction that you just turned. And this is a little kiosk. In the late 80s, a project with one of those gyro-stabilized helicopters, which was at the Exploratorium for many years. This was filmed on a 10 by 10 mile grid at 1 mile intervals, with the camera always tracking by hand the Golden Gate Bridge smack in the center. And the hit here was to have the feeling of tight linkage because of the responsiveness between your hand and the system, and it was a simple trackball control. Again, a little bit later in the early 90s, putting a similar contraption on a tram in Karlsruhe. And this installation afforded me the opportunity to get the scale right. So when you stand at the input pedestal, the field of view is about the same as the taking camera. And that, I think, was pretty successful in feeling more window-like, but it was 2D rather than 3D. And then finally, in the mid-90s at Interval Research, building a stereoscopic contraption, and very simple on a bike, And for a bunch of reasons, frankly, dealing with the politics of place that was going on in the Banff region where I shot, making a statement about virtual travel and sort of the problems going on there. You turn the crank, you go back and forth. So you had the tight linkage of the Golden Gate flyover, better immersion through the stereo, and it was single user, but it wasn't so bad in terms of feeling like being there. So after 15 years of doing this, couple top-level things I learned. One is that you can only go so far moving, merging, and morphing between 2D images. Around this time, like in the mid-90s, a dead end, dumb idea. And, unless you can really make it into 3D models, you're doing some kind of hack. But the other thing that I learned is moving particularly from cars and helicopters down closer to the ground, and being in streetcar, little carts in Paris and pushing things along, is that the community is in your face, and you can't ignore them. So when this sort of stuff came out immediately after Street View was launched, it was no surprise to me. And this was from the London Daily Mail. It was on the front page. I don't know if you can read. It's calling them spy cars and stuff like that. And immediately, like the week after Street View came out, this quote I think sums it up nicely. I don't know whether I'm more terrified or delighted, because it's really cool. It works so well. This is literally from, can you read all? Yeah, February 26. Okay. So the current brouhaha with Street View is particularly in Europe. It's been blocked in Greece. Google's been sued in Switzerland. They had to entirely reshoot all of Japan because the cameras were too high. There's a French phrase, le droit d'image, the right of image. And the courts in the US have always erred on the side of where photographers stand. If they stand in a public place and they're looking through somebody's window of a woman getting undressed or whatever, it's her responsibility to close the shades. That judgment is exceptional in the US. In most other countries, you have more ownership of your image than that. This happened last month in Berlin. A art activist group did a DIY Street View car, nothing but paint and plywood, and they published how to do it, and they built one, and they put a fake Google logo on the side, and they drove up and down the streets in Berlin like driving on the wrong side of the street and acting like they're drinking booze and screaming at people and stuff like that. And this is literally Tuesday, 3 days ago. We strongly believe Street View is completely legal. Google is not an invader of countries. It's not some super spy camera. Now we've heard a bit about the concerns we're going to change things. So this is a hot, lively, and I think very interesting and unresolved area right now. Michael Jones also added, you see the world as you would see it if you were really there. So I don't want us to lose sight of why all of this is going on in the first place. This is as good as it gets in terms of merging Street View, though, with Google Earth. And of course, what you really want is the Google Earth, the Street View images to be part of the model itself. They've actually gotten a little bit better. But this is not like what you see when you're standing on the Embarcadero looking at the ferry building. Okay. This is a frame grab of LA from a couple years ago, and from Google Earth, and it's based on urban data. So all of Japan, for example, has this data available, and you can see that it includes the footprint and the height. About a year ago, portions of LA got an upgrade, and they're still not putting images on buildings yet. That's another problem. But it's looking pretty good, and you wonder, where does this data come from? It actually tells you down here, but how they actually do it is fascinating and quite rigorous. Here's something that I shot from actually my old neighborhood on Telegraph Hill last year. And, on some levels, it's extraordinary that this can be done with photos integrated. And on another level, there's still quite a ways to go. I grabbed this this week, and it's a little bit better, but again, there's still quite a ways to go. Google SketchUp, is a system engaging the community to build buildings, add texture, and so on. When Google opened its warehouse in 2006, now this is actually 2007, I searched USC, there was one building. Today there are over 300. Also early on, searching the Empire State Building resulted in over 1,300 hits, but a lot of sort of experiments, not great models, and now it's down to about 300. So somebody's doing editing. Google Building Maker was introduced just last fall. The idea is to make it easier for communities to add models by make a building with photos we provide. So here I put the place mark on the ferry building. And the result was image 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ostensibly, these multiple views from the air for every building in the cities that they have coverage. What's that about? Are there airplanes flying over every city with super high resolution, super wide angle lenses that can do this right now? Unnoticed? Yes. And of course, it's not only Google. This is Microsoft Bing bird's eye view. So while Google's relied largely on hand-built geometric models, and so has Microsoft, but they've been trying something else. Photosynth, I'm sure you all know, is a joint effort between Microsoft and the University of Washington. It's photo to photo using scale invariant feature transformation, SIFT, combined with random sample consensus, RANSAC. And it's kind of a two-headed thing right now, that it's a slide viewer that allows you to smartly morph from one image to the other, but it also provides a point cloud. The Synthy percentage is how many images were not ransacked, and the more neutral the image is, and the more the lighting is common, the more usable, the higher the synthiness number is here. So maybe not by coincidence, what Google Panoramio has been doing by editorial fiat, Photosynth does by technological limitations. But it also builds the point cloud model, and again, this is really basic stuff, but it's really, really important that everybody understand that point cloud 3D models have no semantic underpinning the way television has no semantic 2D underpinning. And Nicholas Negroponte years ago said there's not a computer in the world hooked up to a television set that can distinguish a love scene from a car crash, and that's still the case. So getting from one to the others is a problem. And this might look very interesting, but again, it's not like what you see when you get there. This is from just 2 weeks ago, New York Times story, a really impressive work of dealing with thousands of images from Flickr. The ransack rate seems to be, for Flickr images, around 80% are gone, 20% are usable. So there's still this issue of neutral images that one can shoot for modeling versus sort of our images that we upload to share with friends. Part of the news story here is that they made it into a game. And the game, you get points, and if you can read this, it says something like, be sure to take pictures of areas that need to be filled in. There was a conference in New York last fall at the New School where a new word seemed to emerge in Don't Laugh, Plaber. This question of when is a community crowdsourcing a job as a game or some other means of giving information to the company, and where is the line there? Now, I'm involved in another project at USC called Movie Tagger, and it's subtitled humbly, A Method and System for Parsing and Richly Tagging Every Movie Ever Made. And of course it involves crowdsourcing, and we're putting some very hard thinking into what works and what doesn't here. And by the way, to me this has less to do with ethics as it does whether it's successful or not, whether a community will go behind it. Google Image Identifier, to me, is sort of probably right on the edge. A lot of my students go evil, being used. Okay, there are two more sort of elements that I'm going to go really quickly through, leave time for questions, and I just want to sort of put them on the record. Liveness, as we know it, is a relatively new concept, and if you can wrap your head around somebody before electronics thinking about somebody somewhere else, like now, like right now somebody in New York, I don't think people could do that. That it required the ability to have some kind of live connection to even think that way. Now, what happens when we have a billion or more video phones that are all capable of being live now? And the question of what's on live right now is a very, very challenging new question. This was a spin-off from Interval Research in 2001 called Kundi, and back then webcams were stationary. There were a lot of them. I think there were actually more then than now. They were all tethered Ethernet connections, and they were mostly pointing at stuff where almost nothing happened all the time. So we developed a human augmented propagation engine where anybody could push a hot now button. Other people could instantly go there if it's interesting, push their hot now button. And our metric was to herd people to an interesting site in seconds. And we had a hot now list that updated every 10 seconds. We're actually doing more work after 10 years on this to sort of upgrade the idea for when people really do have video coming off their phones in the billions. In July 2008, Google Earth added 5,000 webcams. This came sort of out of nowhere. But the webcams aren't streaming. They update every 15 to 60 minutes. So it's not really like moving images. There are now over 13,000, bless you. And they're clearly they're aggregated from many different sources. Here's a project I was involved in last year coming out of Ars Electronica Linz. It's called 80+1, A Journey Around the World for the European Union. And one of the things that we did was a call for proposals for live bits, art exploring real-time connectedness, and had as many as 20 10,000 euro commissions for experimental projects where there was a live component. And in doing this, in a small way, a contribution that we may have made was sort of, there's live in the sense of like playing a video game where the latency has to be under a tenth of a second maybe. There's live in the sense of conversation where the latency has to be maybe under a second. And maybe we can push live to like image exchange to under a minute. Anything more than a minute we called not live, and anything between a minute and a day we called fresh, and anything after a day we called canned. We got 295 entries from 42 countries and selected 15, and I don't think this could have happened a few years earlier. So I'll just show you a few really quickly. This one's called Blowing Air from Beijing to Linz by the art collective 8GG Interactive. And the people live in China are holding up food and going, and the people here see that, and there's a blower below the monitor where the collective made, they look like soap bars. They were sort of scent output devices, then when heated and fanned could give you sort of a whiff of food. Grand Mutual Smiles by Pierre Prosk connected Thimphu, Bhutan with Linz, setting up these booths using what's common now, smile detection on cameras, to just make installations of people smiling in both locations. Digitee by Marion Schmidt was a box that you put your hand in and it had a camera. And there was another box, in this case in Karlsruhe, Germany, where somebody else could put their hand in and you could sort of abstractly interact with this hand. Link Cube by Eugene Ahn and Hai-Ki Min set up a networked photo booth that essentially green screened two groups of people together between New York and Linz. Other projects included a vibration platform triggered by real-time traffic at the entrance of the Gotthard Tunnel in Switzerland, live audio from a town square in Gaza, microblogging from industrial workers in Pitești, Romania, and this project called Wea for Water in Africa, Water in Austria by Melissa Fatoumata Touré, who lived in a little village outside Bamako where there was a single well and a cyber cafe near enough that she proposed instrumenting the well so that we would know in Linz exactly how much water in real time people were pumping, and it was hooked up to an installation to make a point, a real public toilet that would compare water usage, and if somebody was using more water, they would need to put coins in to compensate it for the difference. It was a pretty interesting project, and the only problem is that Melissa Fatoumata Touré didn't exist, and this was done as a prank by a Berlin-based artist named Nicholas Roy. And you know, we had joked about stuff like this earlier, because on some levels, like, we're so easy to fool on this. But we kept it up once we discovered it, and it turns out that the coin slot generated 1,470 euros, which went to a water project in Africa. But you got to be careful with these live things, you know. It's pronounced Patch Bay. I assume that most of you, I hope, know about this. It's a very elegant protocol by Usman Haq in London that is a geolocated protocol for virtually any input and output, and it's mostly used for, it's still in beta, but for monitoring, you know, your home and comparing energy uses. But you could just as easily USB in a switch and USB out a light bulb, and you would be part of this patch bay. This wasn't actually part of the class I taught, but I felt compelled to add it as a final section. Here are the artifacts in Google Earth today with Photosynth, and here are the artifacts, with Street View. Here are the artifacts with Photosynth. There's something different going on here. This you might call artifact by intent, or expressing more with less. This is the Sumi ink landscape by Sesshu Toyo in 1495. There's something different going on here that's equally unreal. One might call this hyperreal. This is, of course, a Bruegel, young folks at play in 1560. And though it might have more photographic verisimilitude than the Sumi ink drawing, it's, I think, obvious that Bruegel didn't look out his window and see this, that this is an accumulation of people and events from either his memory or his imagination. So here are some examples of similar sorts of abstractions done around Earth mapping photos. This is from Art+Com. It's called The Invisible Shape of Things Past, done throughout the 2000s. Jeffrey Shaw's Place, a User Manual. Masaki Fujihata's Fieldwork Alsace, done in the mid-2000s also. And this is pretty much what it looks like. He had students wear a backpack with GPS and angular sensors and walk along paths. And again, the goal wasn't so much verisimilitude as much as what you might call creative experimentation. I had to sneak this in as also what one might call positive artifacts. This is what happens when you film a living room with a motion picture camera in the middle and paint the living room white and project everything back on. This was an installation I did many years ago and redid in 2005. So the people didn't get painted white, so of course they appear as ghosts. And having experimented with this and done it several times, without the motion of things going in and out of registration, it just wasn't interesting. It's these disturbances, these sort of intentional artifacts that I would argue is what the piece is about, and in fact it's called displacements. This was a project done collectively at USC that began in 2006, a little before Photosynth, and we received Google support in 2007. And the idea is to use Flickr-like photos. It was subtitled How to Seamlessly Flickerize Google Earth. Your photos, not neutral photos, as perfectly aligned overlays inside an Earth model like Google Earth. And our secret was to engage a little bit of human help rather than only being able, perhaps in an automated way, but to deal with neutral photographs. I know this is a little bit silly, but Will Carter, one of the colleagues with whom I was working, was walking to the bank, and we had been up to here with Google Earth, and he sort of knew the resolution, and he just took a photo of his foot down, and here it is, perfectly registered where it was taken, and it sums up our intentions, because why he would want to take a photograph of his foot in the bank parking lot, we don't care. And that's kind of the spirit of Flickr, and that's very different from the neutral images that the Earth modelers are making. And there's a difference between shooting for them and shooting for modeling, game or not, and just shooting for yourself. So I'll just play a little bit of this. In making this demo video, we really wanted to select photos that were Flickr-like, that had all of these horrible artifacts that get in the way of SIFT and ransack algorithms and that violate the Panoramio acceptance policy. This business of a little bit of human help, I would like to eliminate that as much as anybody. And now that you're getting angular sensors and cameras, it's becoming more interesting. Actually, we're all quite excited about this project and what it can do. Okay, so what's interesting about Earth models is that it's possible for all Earth models to cross-correlate using the common metric of latitude, longitude, altitude, and time. And this, to me, is an extraordinarily intriguing idea. Like the sections that I covered all too quickly, and I hope at least enough, the One Earth model could be as real as being there. It could be made up of billions and billions of photos. We should be able to freely navigate around. It will include live video and other live sensor data, and could be full of creative experiments pushing the limits of representation. We haven't even discussed the possibility of augmented reality applications, which is a red hot area right now. I would even go so far as to say, it's going to sound a little new age, but when I lie down at night, as long as I know the compass setting of my bed, I can visualize leaving my body in a way that I could not before Google Earth and being 3D. This is a consciousness changer, and I think there's really something significant about that. I am excited and I am hopeful, but I'd like to conclude on a dark note. Shortly after September 11th, 2001, I had a residency in Japan and started getting a little bit obsessed with the question of, if somebody aims a camera at me and I don't want to be in the frame, is there something I can do about it? And the answer is yes. These small, cheap laser pointers, so-called Class 3A lasers, can do a pretty good job. at zapping a camera without doing any damage at all. But the problem was aiming them at larger distances, and for better and for worse, things like rifle scopes here in the US are available quite readily and cheaply. This is at 100 yards. And then things started getting a little out of control. There was a lot of .mil literature on camera zapping. Most of it's no longer online, by the way. And even building something like this was relatively cheap, and this was at 200 yards. So I sort of burned the better part of my artist residency when I should have been working on VR webcams, sort of doing as many studies as I could and writing up everything I know and publishing it online. And shortly after, the New York Times did a story on it. And in like 2 days, I received over 600,000 hits and scores of emails, and I might add several purported death threats. And ironically, anyone who cared to read it, my conclusion was that you have to know where the camera is, and you have to be able to track a moving camera, and these are really hard problems. And the bottom line is that anybody who wants to hide a camera can hide a camera. And the lesson here is that cameras are sensitive issues. And people care about cameras because they care about representation. And I don't even think this is about the privacy issue, which younger generation people might have a different opinion of than their parents. But it is about ownership of one's representation, both individual and collectively. So I'd really like to end with this urging that we need to be more sensitive to these larger cultural forces as well as the technology. And even though it's a corny cliche, it's our Earth. Thank you. So, time for questions? Good. Yes?
So you just showed us your camera zapping setup, and you said it doesn't damage the camera. And I presume you're using a standard 5 milliwatt
3.8, right.
What wattage of laser would actually damage a camera?
I haven't done tests. I do know that in the mid-90s, the International Red Cross Organization banned laser weaponry because the Star Wars level lasers that can knock out a satellite can also knock out, can permanently blow up eyeballs from soldiers miles away. So I can tell you what the extreme other example is, but again, I didn't go there. I got creepy enough as it was.
Unfortunately, can buy them relatively cheaply now and do damage from the laser point, so strictly not legal.
You know, this is why I'd rather not concentrate on the camera. It's funny because the camera zapping stuff trumps all the other work on my website combined. It's kind of scary. So I don't want to continue that. Yes?
So has anyone used all these street view technologies for localization? So you take a picture and it tells you where you are?
There's a great deal of work going on in that area right now, and the iconic images, which I've seen several times, is hand, picture phone, and either the Seattle Space Needle or the Empire State Building. Those are easy. Starbucks, it'll come back with 100,000 hits. There's a market demand for that, and when you think about hybrid approaches like GPS plus computer vision, there's a lot of work in that area. Yes.
So you've sort of given a cluster of scenarios, in a sense, and going back to the street level navigation, supplemented by imagery gathered from kind of everywhere. With regard to sort of who are the actors in that situation? We have a model of still imagery that sits on your lap or on your desk, cinema, and there's a viewer. There are people, objects within the scene. There's some agents involved in the mediation, like Kodak, or Hollywood, with all its conventions. Now, how much of that is getting pulled apart? And are there new actors? I also think of some of what you put there is are voyeurs. Next level up might be a serious lawyer.
Right.
And then there's somebody who really has some.
These are all really good questions. You know, I think my own opinion is that Hollywood is pretty unshakable. It's going to make linear movies, $200 million movies, next year $300 million movies. But, you know, as I hope I've sort of suggested, the Earth representation space is moving very quickly right now. And it's moving in a bunch of directions, and there's a lot of thrashing going on. So a lot of the decisions that are going to be made, both cultural and technological, in the next weeks and months are probably going to affect what we see and what we can experience in the next years. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the connection of the physical reality to virtual reality. You know, we've spent so much time getting excited and diving into our laptops, and then there's stuff that brings us out. And these art projects are incredible and wonderful. And I just wonder if you want to comment on some things that really bring people to appreciate and enjoy the physical world more through some of this,
Well, I'll give you an answer, and I'll give you a question that kind of I think about. The answer is that, again, a lot of these applications have on-location AR potential, and there's a great deal of effort going on in that area. But my question is, as someone who fancies myself as a creative type making walk-in installations, how good is that? So, you know, there was a New York Times Sunday Magazine story a couple months ago on eco-psychology, where they claimed that they there was a study done of invalids with a window, invalids with a flat panel display showing outdoor scenes, and invalids with a blank wall, and that the second and third category were indistinguishable. And I believe that, but I also believe that it's possible to make indoor experiences that you can walk into and that give you a unique appreciation of the planet, and I'd like to see more of that. So, yeah, I think getting outdoors is good, but I do think that there are some sort of site-specific or indoor black box applications that could just knock our socks off. Okay.
I mean, you know, you've been through this longer than anybody, you know, started with the Aspen project, and it's just, as you're saying, it is really an explosion at this moment. In fact, maybe it's over. So, you know, kind of, now that we've done everything we planned to do, you know, isn't it time to move on to what people ever, you know, what isn't going to happen? Geolocation, okay.
Well, you know, I actually think it's just beginning, and the ability, you know, the AR dream is maybe the most focused, because the ability to use your picture phone, or what did Apple call them, iView, or whatever these things that they've patented, and walk around an actual location, seeing what it was like the season before, or thousands of people all aggregated over time, or historical, or people leaving notes, to me is a very intriguing and probably inevitable, probably good idea. Yes?
I have a question in terms of the dimensions. So you talked a lot about the 2 and 3 dimensions, and then the fourth is there, which is time. And with things like Flickr and Google and so on, we're getting more and more filling in space.
Right.
But we're not filling in
Yeah.
the time dimension.
Yeah. That's really hard. How many, if I say BRDF, know what I'm talking about? Okay. Lighting and reflectivity is really, really complicated, and the idea of taking different times and aggregating them into something credible is difficult. And, you know, I don't know, maybe we'll just learn to live with time artifactful representations if we get something interesting out of it. So we might or our children might be accustomed to looking at pictures of Paris with thousands of people that were artificially added, you know, or with nobody that were all extracted.
I just saw a thing about a guy who does Los Angeles, where he takes pictures at different times and then removes everything from the scene that's different between them. So you end up with what we call empty Los Angeles.
Yeah, that was remarkable. I saw that. But those were taken over a short period of time because he wanted to,
Keep the lighting.
yeah, keep the lighting the same. Yeah, you know, again, as we were talking sort of earlier, the dream of waving a camera around and ending up with a 3D model has been a dream of virtual reality from the beginning. But then when you add the time card to it, people start, like, you know, scratching their heads and going, this is even harder than we thought to begin with. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned the reconstruction of the Embarcadero Center as an example of, well, this is not really the experience of being there and looking at the Embarcadero Center. Has there been any effort that you know of to aggregate user-submitted or recorded sounds from different places to try to make the experience a little bit more authentic?
That's a good question. No, I don't, at least in the sense of crowdsourcing. There's a very talented sound recorder named Bernie Krause who's been recording natural, non-urban sounds for decades, and I think he has sound layer in Google Earth right now. But that's a very interesting idea. No, I haven't.
It's interesting. Most of your stuff doesn't use it. Speaking, you use that Conti quote about there's nobody, you know, no program that can look at a video of us love scene in a car chase. The audio that could certainly do it.
Yeah, good point. Yes.
I have a talk from the people at Google about Google Earth. They are working with New York City, getting all their archive photos. There's a legal issue, but what they want is to add so you can travel in time, like in Times Square, and see the basically the buildings, how they were 50 years ago.
I think that's great. And again, you know, if there's one takeaway here, is to make the distinction between images usable in a model versus images otherwise displayed given a model. And they're two different things. They're both good ideas, but they're different things. Yes?
Okay, one more.
I just want to add on to time and space. People in medical imaging have been doing it for a long time. Like ultrasonic imaging, CAP, whatever. Once you have a breathing patient, you have to deal with time artifacts.
Right.
So is the military, and obviously both military and medical imaging have more money up to
Right.
now, so it's a question of time till our computers are fast enough. Yes, the math gets trickier.
Right.
It's a nice PhD thesis for somebody, but
Several.
it can be done, it has
Yeah.
to be done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to sort of see a framework. You know, I've known of your specific.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.